Hi, I'm Allison Law, and you're listening to the Literary Atlanta podcast. This past week, I attended the press launch party for the 2018 AJC Decatur Book Festival. I was joined at Three Taverns Brewery by at least 100 members of Atlanta's literary community, writers and poets, professors and librarians, journalists and illustrators, booksellers, readers, and the incredible staff and volunteers who make the festival a reality year after year. We were also joined by an unexpected guest, Mother Nature. She darkened the door and darkened the room with her torrential rains, thunder, and lightning that popped up during the press launch and knocked out power. But the announcements went on, mostly without the benefit of a PA system, and with the book festival unveiling this year's poster, illustrated by Caldecott honoree R. Gregory Christie, using improvised mobile phone spotlights. Diane Capriola, co-owner of Little Shop of Stories and program manager for the children's and YA stages at the Decatur Book Festival, called Christie one of Decatur's best-kept secrets. He's illustrated more than 60 books and owns Gas Art Gifts, an autographed children's bookstore, gallery, and open art studio located in Decatur. Diane went on to announce this year's Kid Note address, which happens late afternoon on Friday, August 31st of the festival. To celebrate the 20th anniversary of the U.S. publication of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, this year's event will feature popular middle grade and YA authors, including local authors Becky Albertalli, Laurel Snyder, and Nick Stone, talking about the influence of the Sorcerer's Stone on the literary landscape. As a bookend to the weekend celebration, popular wizard rock group Harry and the Potters, featured in the 2008 documentary We Are Wizards, will close out the festival on Sunday with a performance on the children's stage. In adult programming, which sounds much naughtier than it really is, Julie Wilson, who's doing double duty this year as the new executive director and also as program director, announced that this year's keynote speaker is Kenny Leon. Drama nerds will rejoice in this choice. Leon is an internationally acclaimed director and actor of stage, film, and television. He splits his time between Atlanta and New York City. This year, he is releasing his first memoir, Take You Wherever You Go. He'll be delivering the keynote address on Friday evening, August 31st at Emory's Schwartz Center. Now, every year, tickets for the keynote event sell out quickly. If you want to find out when and where you can get your tickets for the keynote address, the festival suggests you like their Facebook page. To learn more about other authors who have confirmed their appearances at this year's AJC Decatur Book Festival, visit the website at decaturbookfestival.com. My role as last year's Associate Program Director of the Decatur Book Festival afforded me the opportunity to spend some time getting to know this week's podcast guest. He serves as an advisor to the festival on all things journalism and storytelling. He helped us shape last year's keynote panel with featured journalist Brooke Gladstone of WNYC's On the Media, an editor of the New York Times, Carolyn Ryan, and Wesley Lowry, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the Washington Post. Our guest is a Pulitzer Prize winner himself. In fact, he tells his story for the first time in this episode about how he learned that he and his co-author were finalists for the prize. But we spend most of our time talking about his latest journalistic endeavor, the Buried Truths podcast that he's hosting for Atlanta's NPR station, WABE. My conversation with Hank Klibanoff is next on episode 42 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. Hank Klibanoff is a veteran journalist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and as we learn a little bit later in this episode, a proud Southern writer. Hank co-authored The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation, which won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for History. A native of Alabama, Hank was a reporter and editor for more than 35 years at Mississippi newspapers, the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then he served as managing editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He holds an undergraduate degree in English from Washington University in St. Louis and a master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Hank is currently a professor at Emory University, where he directs the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project. His involvement with that project eventually led Hank and his students to produce a 6-part podcast series called Buried Truths, which aired this March through May on WABE. It's also available wherever you like to download and listen to your podcast. Here's my conversation with Hank, which we recorded shortly after the final episode of Buried Truths Season 1 aired. Before we start, I want to note that we're recording this interview on May 1st, 2018. Mm-hmm. All 6 episodes of the Buried Truths podcast are now available, and I want us to discuss things that happened over the course of those 6 episodes. So for anyone who is listening, and if you haven't listened to the entire season of Buried Truths, mm-hmm. I encourage you, urge you, beg you to do that now so that there aren't any
because they'll
spoilers.
Get mad at me if I give too many spoilers at WABE because they're really being pretty tough on that. And I guess that's right. So.
The story of Isaiah Nixon, which is kind of at the core of the Buried Truths podcast, came to your attention in 2015. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Around that time. Mm-hmm. In episode 5, you talk about how you found Nixon's case before your semester started through a civil rights cold case project that was out of Northeastern University's law school?
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Okay. The Civil Rights Restorative Justice Project run by a terrific person, Margaret Burnham.
Okay. And that's different from the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Case Project that you were involved with.
Right.
Can you talk about the Civil Rights Cold Case projects and how you got involved?
Sure. There are a few, and probably fewer than 5. Most of us sort of got a start after 2006. When there was a particular case in Mississippi that got a lot of attention, where a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reporter came to Mississippi with a man whose brother had been murdered by the Klan in 1964, and they were determined to solve what happened.
Right.
No one had ever been prosecuted for the history on that is that, of course, everyone knows about 1964 in Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman and James Cheney are killed by the Klan.
Right, these civil rights workers.
That's right. Mm-hmm. On the first day of Freedom Summer. And their bodies are missing for 44 days. And President Johnson sent 200 to 300 sailors, Navy guys, into Mississippi, South Mississippi, and said, dredge every body of water until you find those guys. And the governor at the time, Ross Barnett, famously said in his raspy voice, those boys aren't missing. They're not missing. They're down in Cuba with Fidel Castro having a pina colada and just laughing it up, having a good old laugh on us, Well, in fact, they were missing, and as it was confirmed 44 days later, they were dead.
Yes.
But during that time that they were all these sailors are looking for them, they dredged up 2 bodies over on the other side of the state, over near the Mississippi River. And it turns out that it's these 2 young 19-year-olds, Charles Moore and Henry Hezekiah D., who had been picked up by the Klan, tortured, and killed, thrown into, I won't go into the gritty, awful details, but thrown into this offshoot of the Mississippi, okay? Mm-hmm. And because of this Canadian broadcasting reporter and Thomas Moore, the brother of Charles, they ultimately persuaded one of the Klansmen who was involved, but who had left the scene of the murder. He had been part of the scene of torture, but not murder, to go to work or something like that, to finally tell the truth. And he did. And he told the truth to the U.S. attorney, to a grand jury, to a federal jury, a trial jury, and got conviction of a man named James Ford Siegel, a Klansman. That case, that Alberto Gonzales was the Attorney General at the time under George Bush, and he really wanted to celebrate that case and let everybody know about what the feds had done, never mind what the reporter had done, and that they'd won a conviction. And Alberto Gonzales, it was like he drank the Kool-Aid of cold case reporting. He called this press conference that I'm announcing the FBI Cold Cases Initiative. And he had Robert Mueller standing right there beside him, and you'll hear his voice on our podcast.
It comes up in episode 5,
I think. And then we bring it up again in 6. They announced this whole big project, and they produced a list of about 109 cases. I think it's grown to about 120. Isaiah Nixon was not on there, so I don't want to mislead there. But it was in the time that I'm joining up forces with reporters in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi to investigate a bunch of these cases on our own. And we were called the Civil Rights Cold Cases Project, and there's a website for it. And we were funded by the Center for Investigative Reporting, Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, on a temporary basis. That was 2008, and there was no more money to be had at that point. But at the same time, there was a group at Syracuse University Law School was doing some investigating on these things, though I think they've disbanded. I think they've lost their support. The Northeastern University Civil Rights Restorative Justice Project, which is doing great work. And there's a group of students, undergrads also at LSU, but mostly they do great work, but it's mostly limited to Freedom of Information Act requests, just to get all these records out of the government. And then there's a project at Emory that I teach. So, and I do want to just say one more thing, that the person who deserves the greatest credit for all of this is a reporter for the Jackson Clarion Ledger newspaper, a guy named Jerry Mitchell, who's been doing these cold cases for 25 years. It's because of Jerry that the Birmingham church bombing case got the traction that it got, that the Medgar Evers case, and Jerry's featured in the movie
Mississippi Burning?
No, or the other one. The other one, Ghosts of Mississippi.
Thank you. Right. Yes.
And so, and Jerry was part of our project, but he had long before us won great glory for what he did, won a MacArthur Genius Grant for what he did, So there's a small group that gets passionate about this, and when I was applying to the, Emory for the Cox and James M. Cox Jr. chair in journalism, when it existed.
Well said. Well said, remembering that time.
Yeah, that was part of my pitch, was that I wanted to see if we could if we could, create a course focused just on Georgia cases.
Yes.
And that's what I did. And Brett Gadsden, who was a professor in the African American Studies, said, "Why don't we do it together?" And he knew how to teach a course. I didn't,
at that time.
Right, at that time. And he brought, the wisdom and the skills of a trained historian, and I brought the, furtive wildness of a journalist.
I like that. Yes, yes. And so at what point or who had the idea to turn this project that began in your classroom into a podcast?
That would have been the folks at WABE. Wanya Lucas, who's the CEO over there and just wonderful, had come to me with this. I wanted to hear more about the project. She brought someone who worked in our television side, public broadcasting in Atlanta, about doing a documentary for television. But over time, they started wanting to get into the podcast world. And they pitched that to me, and in some ways that makes a lot more sense for a case in 1948, where you're not going to have as many visuals.
Sure.
You're lucky if you have sound, which we did.
I was so impressed with that, some of the files that you used. Right.
Well, I just believe it's all there. You just have to find it. And so anyway, that was WABE came to me with this idea. Forget television. We want to do podcast. Right.
And how long ago was that?
I don't know. It's been a couple of years.
A couple of years ago. Yeah. Because this is a 3 over the course of 3 years.
The 3 years is since we started teaching the case. I was teaching
for the
Isaiah Nixon long before there was any talk of podcast
Right. And the AJC did an article about the Buried Truths podcast, and it said that you recorded a couple of episodes and it went before a focus group, and the feedback that you got was that it was trying too hard to be like a serial or a true crime podcast. How did you take that feedback and reshape what became Buried Truths?
Right. Yeah, they gave us great advice. We weren't trying to be a true crime genre in that. First of all, I didn't even know podcasts had genres. Okay?
Yeah.
But I learned very quickly because these were experienced podcast listeners, and they heard 2 episodes and they liked this, they didn't like that. That's the way focus groups go. But the one thing that they seemed to hit on was that you're trying to make this true crime, when in fact, I already know the guy's been killed. I already know the guy's dead. In fact, I already know that they know who did it. So where's the mystery? And then they said something that I just loved. I just wanted to go hug them, except that I was behind, a one-way
focus group members.
One-way mirror. But they said, don't be afraid to place this in the history genre. And the fact is, if you look at the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project website at coldcases.emory.edu, and I'm not saying that to plug it, but I'm saying it's an Emory.
Sure.
It's my class's website. You will see that we say very quickly that the purpose of our examination is not to figure out who done it; it's about why. Because in most cases we know who did it. And it's just, what were the atmospheric conditions at the time that would allow some of these most heinous, awful murders to take place? So that was wise. And I loved hearing that from the focus group. They were in sync with us. And I just didn't even know I was sounding like it was, I was building this dramatic voice, is Ted Knight, Ted Baxter, from
the Mary Tyler Moore show,
right? Or was it Lou Grant? Yeah, right. Anyway, so talking like this, but I wasn't. I don't know. So it was a lot better when and there was also another change there. I had a wonderful producer, Kate Sweeney,
I love Kate.
And we just were working really well together. But that was where we were, and then she got hired to the Atlanta Regional Commission and broke my heart. But then I was very, very fortunate to get Dave Barriswain to be the producer after her. And Dave had just a different concept of how to do it, how to write it, and it was less about let's storyboard it all, put it on storyboard, and let's do episode 1, write that and record it. And then let's do episode 2, write that and record it. That's how I had been doing it, And then we'll go to 3, which makes sense in one way. On the other hand, I know, having spent a lot of years working on a book,
right,
that there are times you get to chapter 14 and you say, oh my goodness, these 8 paragraphs, or in my world, probably 18 paragraphs, really belong in chapter 2. Because that explains how this, and this, And so you sit there and cut and paste and move them into chapter 2, build your transitions. Well, the way we were doing the podcast, you couldn't, if you'd already locked up 2, you couldn't move something from what later became episode 4. It's not that you couldn't because you hadn't broadcast it yet, but there's just not going to be much interest in tearing up something that's already been done. Right. You would know better than I at that time. It
is, but the difference between Buried Truths and Literary Atlanta is that we do standalone episodes, so it's just, getting each episode is a contained story, if you will.
Right.
And then you had to set it up and look at it, across 6 different episodes.
Right.
What's my beginning? What's my, narrative arc in the middle? And how do I get to a really gratifying ending?
Well, we put it all up on a wall. When Dave came, we just listed what all our assets are. audio assets, interviews, what things that I want to say, just all on a big wall. And we then from that, in a chronological flow for the most part, but not entirely, we'll say, here's where I would say I want to look at the self-defense alibi.
Yes.
It's where both of these cases, the men who killed Isaiah Nixon and beat up Dover Carter, claimed self-defense. And in neither case is it true, nor is it plausible, nor is it sensible that they had to act in self-defense, okay? But, and I had students at Emory who had done terrific papers on the slam dunk reliability of the self-defense alibi, know. And if anybody ever wants to challenge them, I'm going to show them the student papers, and it was originally my idea for a paper that they look at the self-defense alibi, but I wasn't 100% sure what they were going to find. And sure enough, they found it, So when we're putting this on the board, I would say, now, here's where I really want to go deep on some. Here's where we're going to go into some history. It's not just the narrative flow of what happened, and then he pulled out his gun, he said this, and he reacted this way, boom, boom, whatever, Here's where I want to stop the action and go deeper. And so we had that all on the board, and the plan was to write every single bit of it. But that's a long haul, and we ended up needing to have episode 1 done so that the marketing people could look at it and show it around and, generate some interest. So we did start voicing some of them even before we finished writing it all. But most of it we wrote all early.
Yes. Well, that makes sense, but you also have to have a little bit of flexibility too, because things change,
Absolutely.
In terms of when people listen to it and respond to the stories that you're telling.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't say that based on the responses we were getting, though, we didn't go into it and change it. There is, however, I research things until it's even too late to change things. And
can you give us an example?
Well, yes. You can't know everything. I mean, and I have done a lot of research on this, and the Isaiah Nixon case, the Dover Carter case, the 1948 election, the preceding 46 election, and my students have, But look, I've taught it 2 semesters. Undergraduate students, there are limits, okay? But as you read the documents, the FBI documents in this thing, you see that it feels like over and over again, the same federal prosecutor in Georgia, down in Savannah.
Durrance?
That man named Henry Durrance. You've got a great memory. Henry Durrance seems to be the one who over and over again is saying, no, we don't want to get involved in this. No. Now, there are some letters early on in which he said, yes, we should investigate. But later, when push comes to shove, he's saying, no, we need to close the Dover Carter case. We need to close the Isaiah Nixon case. And all we do in the episode 5 is just sort of lay it out, one by one. Here's what he did. I was doing some more research on him because I just wanted to know who he was, and came across the fact that in 1961, 13 years after he played this other role on the Isaiah Nixon Dover Carter case, he's a judge, a state judge, Superior Court, and he is the first, and Superior Court judges at that time named the members of county voter registration boards.
Oh, wow.
Why that happens, I don't know. And usually it was to guarantee that only white people would be on those boards, okay? And it had worked. Henry Durrance, named the first black person to sit on a county voter registration board, okay? And I thought, well, that's out of character from the guy, and so I was going to get that into episode 6 any way I could. It was sort of too late for episode 5, but I was going to get it in there.
Definitely.
Just, 1, it's a matter of fairness, and 2, there's nothing wrong with, complicating people because they are complicated.
Right. Well, I loved, again, that you were able to find audio files. I think that was a very damning thing in episode 5.
Esco Graham in this case.
Esco
right.
Graham,
The
right,
judge,
who was
right.
the judge who was trying to decide whether or not to pursue the case any further, was next door neighbors to the sheriff.
Well, he was next door neighbors to the Talmadges.
To the Talmadges, that's right.
When for many years he had seen Herman Talmadge grow up as a young boy. I was very curious about Esco Graham. And in fact, didn't know anything about him. I mispronounced his name for the longest time. It's Eschol, and I'm calling him Eschol. And somebody corrected me, no, who knew him? Said, no, it's Esco Graham. And there was a book, The Wild Man from Sugar Creek, written by a guy here in Atlanta, William Dub Anderson. He was an advertising and marketing guy. And I looked in the book, and there, sure enough, I mean, we've got Esco Graham, who sat on the Isaiah Nixon case, who sat as the judge on the trial of the 2 white men who killed Isaiah Nixon over voting, according to the sheriff. That's why he arrested him. And Esco Graham, as I'm looking at Dub's book, it says he was part of the inner circle of Eugene Talmadge. And I turned to one of my students and said, there's probably more here, you know. And he did a great paper, Michael Green. He's teaching around here and Teach for America here in the Atlanta area.
That's great.
And he did a great paper on him. And he, if I recall, he had read and then wrote about that speech in which he gives, you know, glowing endorsement, Esco Graham does, of Herman Talmadge. And then I believe it was Dave Barriswain who then went and found the tape. It's all there. It's all out there. You can find anything. It's just...
It's a lot of time and a lot of work, though, to dig up all of those little details. Even the pronunciation of difference between Eschol and Escol. I mean,
right.
that's very much. That's not really a problem that you had when you were writing a newspaper story.
No, that's right. That's right.
You have written across many different media. You know, you're a former newspaper reporter and editor. You've written a book. You've written now for academic audiences, and now with Buried Truths, you're writing for podcast listeners. What challenges or opportunities did that present for you?
I never worked for the wire services, so I never adopted short sentences as sort of the perfect way to write. And I always believed that if you write with a rhythm, you can go as long as you want, as long as it's a rhythm that works for the reader. So I tend to write long, 1 long stories and 2 long sentences within stories, and that doesn't work in radio. You know, but the discussion that we'd sometimes have, if there was a disagreement, was I would say, you know, that I'm not writing for radio. I'm writing for podcasts, and the people who come to podcasts are likely to be more, have some expectation that this has to unfold, that something's going to take a little time, that you can render a story, that you can be telling a story and in a Robert Penn Warren-ish sort of way, go off on a little detour and go down a path and look behind you and people are still following you, and then take another little detour, and then stories within stories within stories. And then finally you bring them all out to the main road and you return to the main story that you were telling, and you turn around and everyone's still there. Probably there's no one in radio who would agree with me on that. We had to work through some of those things. Mm-hmm. But I think we did.
A couple of weeks ago, I saw the video of the Washington Post newsroom gathered around this large monitor to watch the live 2018 Pulitzer Prize announcements. I'm wondering if you have a Pulitzer Prize story, if you remember where you were and how you heard that your book that you co-authored with Gene Robertson won a Pulitzer.
Well, yes. But I don't talk about it publicly.
Oh, okay.
No, generally, the Pulitzers are secret. You don't know. In fact, you don't know that you're a finalist almost always until they announce the winners. Mm-hmm. And then you learn, if you were a finalist but not the winner, that you won, and then you learn that you lost. So I mean, who wouldn't want to be a finalist? You're one of the top 3 in whatever category. And the category that I was in with my co-author, Gene Roberts, was history, a book on history. But so the Pulitzers are always announced in April. But the decisions are made a couple of months before of who the finalists are.
Okay.
But the decision of who the winner is won't happen until like a week before they're announced in April. And so in this case, I guess the finalists have been picked in the previous December. In fact, I was driving. You want to know exactly where? Absolutely.
Sure.
I was driving to the Atlanta Press Club, had an annual book event.
I'm familiar with that event, yes.
I'm trying to remember the name of it, but and
it's the annual holiday party.
That's right. That's right. And bringing book authors to sell their books for holiday gifts. And it was at Fernbank. And I am driving off Freedom Parkway right past the Carter Center when I got a call from someone, and I won't tell you who it was from, who had heard from somebody who did know, and I knew how they knew, that, and I wasn't jonesing to know this, okay? I didn't have any expectation of ever know, but had heard that the Race Beat was a finalist for a Pulitzer. And that was a very tearful moment. I mean, I didn't even think about it. And I told my wife, because she was in the car with me, and I actually had it on speakerphone.
Yes. And
she heard that, and I hear I'm getting ready to go to this big book event where I'm selling 2 books. I want to yell, "Don't you know?" But I couldn't.
Yeah, you had to hold on to that for 4 months.
That's right. And I didn't tell, the only people I told were my co-author. I did tell my agent, but we decided we would not tell anybody. We weren't going to tell the publisher because we don't want them to start going crazy. And then having the Pulitzer board hear that and say, wait a second, they shouldn't be talking about that. He shouldn't even know. And, deny us an opportunity for it.
Right.
So I just held that to myself from, I think it was December until April.
Whew, that's a hard secret to hold on to for that long.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't finished reading The Race Beat, but I was really pleased to find that some of the stories that are in that book carry over in Buried Truths. Specifically, Gene Talmadge and the 3 Governors controversy, which became a bonus episode of Buried Truths.
Right.
Why was that controversy in Georgia and national news and such a pivotal story in how, especially the northern press, covered civil rights struggles here in the South?
Well, I think for one thing, it was just comedic. It was funny. It was unbelievable that you've got this man like Gene Talmadge. And for those people who didn't know Gene Talmadge, I'm trying to think of who a modern day analogy would have been. George Wallace was sort of a latter day Gene Talmadge, but actually a little saner than Gene Talmadge. He was just this rapaciously racist guy who would stomp around the stage. He would stalk a stage and, speak in high tones and full of invective and calling other candidates names. If I had to come up with a current person who he reminds me of, let's see, I'd probably have to go all the way to the White House, doing that kind of mean-spirited invective. And he's running and he's a white supremacist. The Ku Klux Klan is inside the inner circles of his offices, okay? Well, openly. Everyone knows this, okay? And he runs he's already served, so that we're talking about the 1946 election. He's already been governor 3 times, okay? Now, these were 2-year terms, but not in succession, okay? And then he's running for a 4th time, and 1946, and he gets elected, sort of. He doesn't win the popular vote. But in Georgia, you weren't voting for statewide officials by popular vote. We had the equivalent of an electoral college. It was called the county unit system. And rural counties got more heavily weighted votes than urban. And I'll just give you quick math on that. Fulton County got 7 votes. So whoever wins the popular vote in Fulton County gets 7 votes in their column. And that was the guy from Marietta area, James Carmichael. He was by comparison, racial progressive businessman. But Talmadge said, he would never run in a county that had a streetcar, and he's only running in the rural counties. And each rural county got 2 votes. So you can quite quickly see that you only have to, and Georgia, you recall, has 159 counties. Now, if they did back then, I'm not sure, but a large number. Yeah. We have the second highest number of counties in the U.S. behind Texas. So you really just have to win 4 rural counties in the South, Georgia, which was easy for Talmadge, to have more votes than Fulton County. Okay, and he swept all of those rural counties in South Georgia. So while Gene Talmadge in the 1946 election wins only 43% of the popular vote and comes in second, he wins 60% of the county unit vote and wins the Democratic nomination for governor. And when you win the Democratic nomination in a state that's 90% Democrat, you become the governor. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And that was a lot of history that I thought was fascinating, but to put it in episode 1 would have really blocked the flow of the narrative. So we decided to do that as a bonus episode.
Yeah, I thought that was, I had not known that there was a county unit system. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's also shows that here we are 60 or 70 years later, looking just at the state of Georgia, and it's still politically divided between the city with the streetcar in it and the rural communities outside of Atlanta.
That's right. And that was their way of holding on to power in the state by weighting the vote in their direction.
Yeah. Well, you and Roberts write in the Race Beat that at no other time in U.S. history were the news media more influential than in the 1950s and 1960s. Do you still stand by that statement?
Yes, I do. And mostly I would have just said newspapers. You know, I mean, obviously television came on at a hugely important time in the civil rights movement. And television is new and it's exciting and it's immediate. And it goes straight to the brain. It's like this drug, and it goes straight to the brain. And it's all changing in front of people's eyes, okay? And suddenly everything that's happening that they've been reading about that seems so distant is right in their living room. And this is when it was a simpler time, as you know, 3 television stations nationally. Yes.
I was the remote control for a while. Get up and change it to channel 3.
Right, exactly. Right. And the national broadcast of news, Huntley Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, was only 15 minutes. It wasn't 30 minutes, and it certainly wasn't an hour, and there weren't all these other programs, although it was a period back then in the early 60s, it was a great period of documentaries that were done. But yeah, until September of, 63, when Walter Cronkite took the CBS News to 30 minutes. Everything was 15 minutes. And so it was a simpler time, so the few dominant media there were could have an outsized influence. And I'm talking about newspapers as well.
Right. And because you mentioned in the book, this was also when there was a morning edition and there was an evening edition of the paper. So I would say that it was less diffuse in terms of their impact.
That's right.
Than today's media, where we all have our chosen bubble of information.
Right. That's right. And, we were living in a period where what news is supposed to be was different. For better or for worse. I know this is something I talk about in my ethics class. When I was growing up, if you said to anybody, well, what do you want your newspaper to be? Or what do you want your news broadcast to be? And everyone would gravitate to that one word, objective. Objectivity was the holy grail, Well, oddly enough, and for good reasons, not bad reasons, although at first blush someone might say, well, that's just terrible. It's worth knowing that objectivity is no longer the holy grail. I'm going to tell you why it's good instead of bad.
All right.
It was stripped from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. I I'd have to go back and recalculate, but 25, 30 years ago, it no longer says a journalist should seek to be objective. It says they should seek to be fair, and they should seek to be accurate. But the problem with objectivity, in fact, our own Atlanta Constitution editor, Ralph McGill, called it the cult of objectivity, in which it was handcuffing news organizations. So if Joe McCarthy got up and said, in my breast pocket, I've got the names of 23 State Department employees who are members of the Communist Party, and he would not show it, and he would not reveal it, he got the headline anyway, and he got the story anyway. And if a reporter wanted to say, well, do we know this to be true? And he's talking to his editor, and his editor said, well, you better go find somebody who will say it's not, because that's the only way we're going to do it. And there was no thought to trying to investigate it and trying to debunk it. So in the end, it just became handcuffed. So what Ralph McGill would say was, so you've got Joe McCarthy saying this, and it's not true. Let's say it's not true. And then you've got somebody else countering it, but you don't even know if what they're saying is true. And they may fudge a little bit too. And so suddenly you've got one falsity added on top of another falsity, and you've lost any hope of finding the truth. What you've seen in recent years is the press, broadly speaking, I'm talking about the press,
right,
news, deciding that it has the right, it has the responsibility to challenge assertions by public officials. And they don't have to go to find some rival senator just to get them on the record saying, no, that can't possibly be true, when they don't even really know. You investigate it yourself.
And it becomes almost false equivalencies.
That's exactly right.
As long as I get somebody who's on the quote-unquote opposite side.
That's exactly right.
Then right. I've done my duty.
Right. So fairness and accuracy are hugely important, but not necessarily objectivity.
Excellent. So what's next for Buried Truths? Is there going to be another season?
Well, I'm sure we will talk about it. I have other cases that I really like that we've looked at in my class. There was a terrific case of that we've done down in South Georgia and Terrell County. That was one of the first big cases we covered. James Brazier, a man killed in 1958 for driving a 1958 Chevrolet Impala, brand new. He worked, at the dealership, the Chevy dealership, doing whatever they would allow a black man to do at the time. And maybe he got an employee discount, but he worked 3 jobs. His wife worked 2 or 3. They had good money, and he could afford a new car. And he bought himself one, and he just asked. It was as if he was just begging to be a target. And I don't really mean he deserved it, but I'm just saying the police were on him all the time. And he said, why come you keep stopping me and beating me up? And one of the policemen finally said, you got a lot of nerve driving a car like that when we can't hardly live. So that's one of the cases that we've done a lot of work on. There's a case of a 17-year-old kid in Macon who was killed by 2 police officers on the basis of misidentification, basically, of this kid. A white woman had seen somebody steal a gun from her husband's glove compartment. And by the time they go out looking with police, the police show up at their house, say, hop in the car, let's go try to find him. Oh, and wow. They do, and they come upon, this black kid, 17-year-old, with his girlfriend standing outside a school in Macon, and the headlights go up on him, and the white woman says, that's him there. And what I can tell you is that if you look at the whole way he spent his night, based on a lot of people who had no connection to anything, it wasn't him. Well, they did find a gun. It wasn't the right gun. Anyway, that case was tragic because the police began shooting their guns before they even got out of the car. And he starts running, and they shot him dead. It's very much an echo of the Laquan McDonald story in Chicago that later became revealed through videotape that the police had tried not to release for so long.
Wow.
So there's opportunities there to do more podcasts. So I'm sure we'll talk about that.
That sounds great to me.
Well, good.
Was there anything that I didn't ask you or that we didn't cover that you wish we had?
Well, No, I'm just, it's interesting. I partly because you do so much to help elevate writing and the art of writing and storytelling through the podcast. And while it's not all Southerners necessarily, or in my lifetime, I can say there's been an evolution that makes me very just proud to say I'm a Southern writer. I would never have thought of myself as a Southern writer. I was a newspaper reporter. That's what I was, Mm-hmm. But as time goes on, I thought, well, if you had to ask me, I'd say, well, yeah, I'm a Southern writer, And
at what point did that happen? When did it occur to you that you were?
About 8 seconds ago. But no, I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't realized until I got through with this podcast and people were saying, gosh, you've written in so many different genres or something. And I thought, well, I've never written a play. I can think of the things I haven't done.
Well, put it on your to-do list.
I was asked recently to write liner notes for music. And I would have if we hadn't been in the last month of the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
So I like to find new ways to write. So
yeah, I think that's a perfect moniker for you then. Southern Writers at all. You've got the whole platform.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the program. I just think it's fantastic.
Right after Hank and I met to record that interview, he sat down with WABE reporter Ross Terrell to record a bonus episode of the Buried Truths podcast. Make sure you listen to that and the rest of season 1 of Buried Truths. Again, that's available on the WABE website and wherever you find your podcast. Turning to book and author events dotting the Atlanta calendar in the coming week, Karis Books and More is hosting a slew of events that celebrate Pride this month of June. On Tuesday, June 19th, the bookstore welcomes Rochelle Donegan, co-author of Long Weekend, Guidance and Inspiration for Creating Your Own Personal Retreat. Donegan has studied and taught yoga since 2003. She'll present a handful of exercises from Long Weekend to help you envision your own technology-free weekend retreat to inspire personal and creative renewal. Sounds delicious. The following night, Wednesday, June 20th, Karis partners with Atlanta Pride to host a Stonewall Month conversation with Darnell Moore and Ashante Reese about Black queer liberation, feminism, and freedom. Moore will share stories from his new book, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age Black and Free in America. Zami Nobla, Atlanta Pride, and Karis welcome Leona Beasley for a special Stonewall Month reading on Saturday, June 23rd. Beasley, a self-described Southern Lesbo warrior king, writes about eccentric, funny, and often queer characters from the South. Her debut book, Something Better Than Home, is a 2018 Lambda Literary Award finalist and depicts the life of a young lesbian coming of age and coming out in the 1970s South. Visit the Karis Books and More website to learn about their incredible lineup of events and the suggested donations for each event. In other places, we've got Tuesday, June 19th, Atlanta author Wendy Wax will be reading from and signing copies of her latest book, Best Beach Ever. On Wednesday, June 20th at 7:30, YATL returns to the Decatur Library thanks to Georgia Center for the Book. YATL is described as a zany, Jimmy Kimmel-esque live talk show for readers and writers of young adult literature. YATL's guests this time are Zoraida Cordova, Danielle Clayton, Julie Murphy, Scott Reintgen, and Mark Oshiro. Remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website. That's literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you get your podcast. Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.